Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's great to have you with us today. This is our inaugural Food Futures Seminar. So, we're really pleased to see so many of you on the call. And to have such a wonderful speaker for you today. And it also kicks off Food Policy Month for the University of Nottingham. So at the beginning of next month, we will be running our food policy internship program. And we have a number of talks over the next month, starting with Beth's today, that will be a great introduction into the role that food policy plays within our food system and how people can engage with policymakers and make things happen.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with the University of Nottingham and to get an opportunity to meet with, I think, a number of the representatives, hopefully others who are here on this call and for this session. I think from even the behind the scenes introductions we've already done, I think there are a number of areas where we probably have already intersected with one another, and maybe as a result of this particular presentation may find some new and interesting ways to collaborate even more. So in the time that I have, what I would like to do is really sort of give you some of my thoughts on some of the work of FAO, but then obviously also touch on some of the global trends and challenges that we see, and obviously the very critical role of agri-food systems in trying to address those. I think before I move into the state of the world of agriculture, let me just start with a little bit about FAO. I have learned over the 5 years that I have been with this organization that there are some that I come across in the food and agriculture landscape who are incredibly well familiar with FAO. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are actually a number of policymakers, maybe even students, maybe even business leaders who aren't quite as steeped and familiar with our work. But we are 80 years old this year. FAO is maybe the timeline is a little small here for you to see, but FAO was founded in October of 1945. And in fact, you might be familiar with the date 16th of October and know it as World Food Day. We certainly know it as that as well and celebrate it, but we are very personally connected to the 16th of October because World Food Day is the birthday of the Food and Agriculture Organization. I won't spend time in this particular session on the politics, the geopolitics, the economics, the historical period of that mid to late 1940s timeline, because I think we all know what was happening in the world then. And there was a very sincere concern about whether or not there would be sufficient food availability for the people of the entire planet. And it's very interesting that as we find ourselves, I think today in 2025, the very beginning of this year, we still are having some of the same concerns, perhaps differently than in the 1940s where there was concern about food availability. I think the difference for today in 2025 is that there really is enough food in the world for the people who live here. But we have today accessibility and affordability issues that I think really ultimately need addressing. We started with 34 countries signing the declaration, the constitution of the organization. And in 1951, we began, we were housed in the United States, but in 1951, we moved here to our current headquarters in Rome, Italy. And as Peter mentioned, I think in the introduction, it's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We are a specialized technical agency inside the UN, similar to WHO, for example, which is the technical agency of the whole multilateral system focused on public health, human health, etc. And our real mandate is to really lead in a number of the efforts that we collectively have globally to really alleviate hunger and poverty. We focus most of our work around obviously supporting farmers, on supporting rural communities, but obviously this space of food and agriculture and technical capacity, technical development is really at the center of what we do. We have 195 members and we work in over 130 countries. This is, I think, a sort of important slide to just stop on for just a moment, because I think even for myself, coming from outside the UN system, despite my, sort of background in international relations and studying of the multilateral system, I will tell you, I have been probably on multiple occasions personally quite surprised at how complicated and how bureaucratic, candidly, a system can be when you have fully 195 members in your institution and in your organization that really have voices in the work that we do. So FAO doesn't sort of stand completely independently of our members. It's very similar to the UN General Assembly itself, and we are one country, one vote. When we publish strategies to guide the work of the organization, currently we have a climate change strategy, we have a private sector engagement strategy, we have a biodiversity and a science and innovation strategy. These are all strategies that are written inside the organization, but ultimately need full approval and endorsement by our governing bodies, by these 195 members. And we really try our best to operate by consensus. So you can imagine in today's highly politicized world, much of it charged because of issues outside of agriculture, but even incredibly different national or regional views and priorities about themes and issues in agriculture, different views on climate change, different views on livestock, different views on water management, different issues on forestry. These all come out in the debates and the deliberations of our work and how we develop it. And so on one hand, I can probably say to this group, there are days that I think this is probably one of our biggest obstacles as an institution because of the time and the sometimes maybe what feels like a bit of compromise, maybe too much compromise that you have to put into some of your pieces of work. But on the flip side, I think in a time where we are so highly, again, fragmented and seem like the differences between and among countries and nations and regions are so steep, I am fully convinced that you need a place like FAO where all of the countries of the world, the regions can come together and have the complicated, complex, difficult discussions about these topics that are so relevant to the issues that the world is facing. And when I say we work in over 130 countries around the world, that means we have 130 or more country offices around the world. So FAO is currently about 16,000 people strong. 3,000 of us are based here in Rome at our headquarters, which means the other 12 to 13,000 colleagues and staff are in these 130 countries around the world. And we have been present in most of these countries for decades, which means that one of FAO's largest comparative advantages is the fact that we have built deep personal professional relationships with national governments, with their heads of state, with their ministers, with their other local academic institutions, with their farming communities because of the work that we do very directly in the field. So this is something that I think, again, a lot of people don't always realize the scope and the span of our footprint and the way that we work as an organization. So what is the nature of FAO's work, and what do we really do? We do a lot, and it's really incredibly diverse, can be incredibly complex work. But I think with the cloud that's here, let me pull out just a couple of words that I think will give you maybe at a high level a sense of what we really prioritize. I mean, the very core of our work is really centered around data and around market intelligence, data analysis, policy analysis. We are sometimes considered by some of our partners as sort of the global Ministry of Agriculture in a way. You have a lot of national governments that publish their own national data on commodity production, on food prices, on other types of very important, data trends. We do that at the global level and do that for really the countries of the world. And, coming from the United States myself, I know how, very advanced the U.S. Census of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, statistics services are. Private sector is even there collecting data about crop forecasting and other kinds of important trend lines. There are countless countries around the world who don't have that infrastructure, don't have available price and market information. And so our ability to provide this in terms of market information is really critical to, I think, all of us in trying to understand the dynamics of food and agriculture. Inside that, we also take on pretty difficult, I think, policy topics and try to dive deeply into those. The impacts of subsidies on agriculture worldwide, the true cost accounting of food, the impacts of various climate extremes on agriculture, the role of women in global agri-food systems. So this kind of market intelligence, data analysis, and policy analysis is something that we really have at the core of what we do. The second piece is also in the word cloud, which is standards. We are the home to the Codex Alimentarius, to the International Plant Protection Convention. These are the forums, these are the places where regulators, policymakers, private sector, national governments all come and actually discuss and debate and try to advance global standards in food safety, in the case of Codex, and also in the trade of plant and plant-related products in the case of the IPPC. And so this normative space of standard setting is a really important integral part of what FAO provides to all of our members in terms of our work. Then the third area is really our sort of long play, long game, technical capacity building at the country level in all of these different areas of agriculture. It might be in forestry, it might be in fisheries, it might be in irrigation management, it might be in plant production and agronomy, farmer training. We have an incredible set of technical divisions in this organization, steeped with technical experts who really spend time at the field level, really trying to build and advance the agricultural and food systems of a given country. The fourth area, though, is the one I'm going to pivot into in the next part of my talk, and that is our work in emergencies. This is an area that I would say to all of you, FAO has really been pulled into, as opposed to FAO seeing this perhaps as our core mission and our core mandate. We consider ourselves, as I said earlier, to be a specialized technical agency, but more and more we are finding ourselves being in many parts of the world having to respond almost alongside our humanitarian partners trying to provide emergency agricultural assistance to people who are affected by conflict. As we now are realizing today, it started in about 2023, 2024, conflict surpassed climate change and economic downturns as the major driver of food crises around the world. And I probably don't have to list them. It's sad to see that some places conflict implications are almost sort of falling off the public's radar screen, being overshadowed by the next conflict. It started with Ukraine, it moved to Israel, Gaza. We've kind of lost sight of Sudan. Now we have Syria, Lebanon, don't forget Yemen. There's also Haiti, there's Myanmar. The list is very long. And what we are finding is that in these conflict settings, obviously people's livelihoods are incredibly affected, but they also are situations where we are seeing complete devastation of agriculture, and countries and people who were once able to feed themselves are now becoming dependent on food assistance, food aid, and other types of support. But the frequency and intensity of climate change as well, and weather extremes are also incredibly concerning in terms of how we respond in these different settings. I was looking through some statistics that we have, and in fact, in 1960, for perspective, there were, and I would imagine that the record keeping was probably in 1960, not what it is today in 2025, but in 1960, there were 30 recorded climate disasters in that given year. In 2023, the most recent year for this same kind of record keeping, there were 363 recorded climate disasters. And again, you know them. I mean, I think in some ways the climate crisis is almost like the COVID-19 pandemic in a sense that it's almost just ubiquitous, meaning it affects everyone. Every one of us in some way in our life, I think, is probably seeing, no matter where we live, the impacts of the climate crisis. Hotter temperatures in the summer, no snowfall in the mountains where you enjoy going skiing, an earthquake, a flood, a protracted drought, all of these things, the changing temperature patterns, the changing nature of the seasons, the harshness of the weather extremes. You can imagine, I'm following very closely safety of friends and family in California with the wildfires in Los Angeles. Again, these climate issues are also in many countries of the world creating very difficult situations for food and agriculture. And we are still suffering in many parts of the world to the implications of economic downturns. We've got food price inflation of over 50% in some of the countries that are the ones most affected by these other types of, whether it's conflict or climate. Countries like Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, and Zimbabwe are all in this category of countries with currently food price inflation at 50% to even 100% annual rates. This obviously is reducing people's ability to even buy any food if it's available on the local market, and certainly creates really large food import bills for many countries. So I want to dive just a little bit deeper into some of the numbers and the detail of this food insecurity situation that we are facing in this current period. This schematic, this continuum, it's called the IPC Acute Food Insecurity Scale. This is the integrated food security phase classification. That's the long name for the IPC acronym. But this is how we in the global humanitarian multilateral system measure the scale of food insecurity within a given country. And really there are, as you see here, 5 phases. We focus on the 3 that you see the urgent action required arrow as marking. Phase 3 is considered crisis. Phase 4 considered emergency. I won't read the details of what's the characterization of each of these, but phase 5 gets us to catastrophe and famine. And we put these 3 categories, bundle those together, add the numbers of population in a given country in each of those categories to find a total number of the level of acute food insecurity in a given country. And this shows you where we are most recently, end of 2023, compared to where we were in 2016. And this is, let me just say, very discouragingly, also a very similar trend to too many other metrics we have around alleviating hunger and poverty and finding ways to get the right food, the healthiest foods, the healthiest diets to people who most need them. We are certainly off track in just far too many measurements of the Sustainable Development Goals these days. And this, I think, is one reflection of that. In 2016, you can see we had 108 million people in those IPC 3, 4, and 5. So again, this is a measurement of the worst conditions in a grouping of countries. And in that period of 2016, it was 48 countries. Today, we are at 282 million people in 59 countries. And I've tried to give you a sense of a breakout of 36 million of that total are in that emergency IPC 5 category. And we do now have famine occurring again in the Sudan, and with a very high risk of famine in level 5 in Gaza as well. We have had famine only 4 times in the last 20 years. And so it is a very notable and marked event when we reach the IPC 5 level. And I think one of the other most interesting points, it's not mentioned on this slide, but I want to share it with all of you because it expresses, I think, the point about why FAO is so engaged in this area. 80% of the 282 million people are part of an agricultural livelihood or lifestyle, come from a rural community in their country. So let that sink in for just a minute. Coming from a farming background myself, deep roots with my family, committed to agriculture as a part of our livelihood. It's a noble, it's a respected profession. 80% of the people who are the most vulnerable, the most hungry are farmers, they're livestock herders, they're fishermen and women. And we have, I believe, an obligation to find new and different ways to support them. And for us, we focus mostly on ensuring that we get as many seeds, fertilizers, animal vaccines, animal feed, fishing hooks, fishing nets, as a part of those traditional humanitarian responses to these people who are most in need. I won't spend much time here. I've already mentioned in some of my other comments some of the countries most affected, but of these 282 million people, I just wanted to show you the top several countries where we have the largest proportion of people who are really most vulnerable. And again, I think you're probably all well familiar with the challenges of many of these countries, but certainly Africa and the Near East are really, in the Asian region as well, are the places where we are spending the most time. And as if that weren't enough, if it wasn't just that set of challenges that we have to navigate, we also have each of the ones listed here. And as I was putting this list together, I always feel for us at FAO that sometimes it's dangerous to begin a list because the moment you start a list, I'm sure that for those of you who are here with me on the screen, you're going to think of probably 3, 5, 10 other challenges to agri-food systems that maybe I haven't listed here. So please don't consider this to be an exhaustive one, but I think you are probably all, again, well enough familiar with a number of these sort of controversial, complicated, complex issues that are happening within food and agriculture that all deserve continued attention, that need investment, that need policy changes, they need research, they need technical capacity to be brought around them. And these are all areas where FAO staff and colleagues in our technical divisions are trying to work to help bring better approaches, better systems to our member countries and to those that we work with. And I think, you know, this maybe has been said, you know, by others who come from agriculture, but again, coming from a farming background and spending my whole career in and around agriculture generally, I probably am one who gets quite defensive about many of the, I'll say, sort of attacks, the finger pointing, the problem. The problem is agriculture. And I think for all of us, maybe it's just the nature of my personality, try to be optimistic rather than pessimistic, try to see the glass half full as opposed to half empty. I see agri-food systems as really being a part of the solution to all of these challenges that I have talked about. It's not to deflect, and it's not to say that agriculture is not a contributor and has been a contributor in the past, but I think the narrative and what we are trying to bring to solutions is really to ensure that agri-food systems can become more efficient, can become more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable, and be a better support to people, the planet, and our overall, hopefully, prosperity as well. So how does FAO approach this transformation of agri-food systems? This is a schematic out of our current strategic framework. And we really operate around what we call the 4 betters. We focus on transforming agri-food systems through these lenses of how do we create better production systems? And then beyond production, how do we focus on a better environmental framework? And then from there, how do we turn our attention to better nutrition? And if we then have focused on production, the environment, nutrition, we move to better life. And better life is not just about livelihoods. Better life is also very much where we see the work that I described earlier around the humanitarian responses of making sure that just life itself is protected. And agriculture has a role to play in that. So here, the items that are listed in each of these boxes, I won't go into detail on each one of them, but these components of the 4 betters are what we call our program priority areas. So these are really the 20 sort of priority platforms, the priority areas of emphasis for our organization. And everything that we do leads up to our support for especially 3 of the SDGs. SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, and SDG 10, reduced inequalities. I think one of the things that I also wanted to touch on before maybe I turn to maybe some ways forward and a couple of comments on some things that I think we can all join into to try to think about solutions for agri-food systems transformation. But I think one of the ways to think about how agriculture and agri-food systems need to be responsive, need to be more adaptable, need to be more resilient is through the lens of risk. And we know that risk will be ever present. There is really, I think, no such thing any longer as zero risk. And for agriculture, I think, and agri-food systems, one thing that we have to be better at, and I think that the COVID-19 pandemic showed us this, I think we're seeing this with the climate issue, and as we really think about climate mitigation, not just climate adaptation, agri-food systems have to be in a better place to be able to contribute to minimizing the risk that is possibly present. So for example, how do we increase our investment in early warning systems, in better anticipatory action, in spaces where we now have better meteorological data, we have better tools, better predictive tools, we have better data sets, we have better forecasting capabilities. If we can, in conjunction and collaboration with others, harness the power of that information and that data, can we get ahead of a typhoon? Can we then pre-position emergency responses? Can we do a better job of storing fishing boats, perhaps, that might get damaged in that weather event, and limit and prevent damage that might come? We know that as a result of the pandemic, there is now very much heightened interest in issues around zoonotic diseases, the transmission of those diseases from whether it's animals to humans, et cetera. But this now space of thinking proactively, preventively about One Health. And One Health for us is not just animals to human. One Health to us starts with the soil. It starts with plants. It moves into environment, it then goes to animals, and then goes to humans. It's that whole continuum. And so there is, I think, much for us to be able to do in a preventative system there. Beyond the science and beyond the research, there are things like, how do we ensure we have better financing tools? How do we increase agricultural insurance mechanisms so that we can help farmers, especially in Africa, reduce the risk of weather extremes or crop losses? How do we get proactive about the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and make the livestock industry worldwide better prepared and better adaptive? How do we put better seed varieties into the hands of farmers that are drought resistant or heat resistant, better weather tolerant? So this is, again, also not an exhaustive list, but I think it's important to think about some of our solutions through this lens of just getting ahead of the next challenge or the increase in the challenge. But at some point, we also have to be in a position where we think about the solutions or the responses as we're just coping with the risk itself. And there, I really want to make a statement on the importance, especially in the policy world, around encouraging national governments to have the right social protection mechanisms in place to support the most vulnerable, to support access to food, especially for women, especially for the disadvantaged, making sure that we do pay attention to that kind of equity and inclusion is really important. Trade is another important area, and how we make sure that markets are maintained, markets are kept open to boost farmer productivity and income. How do we improve infrastructure? And how do we also make better investments in innovations of all types in food and agriculture? And this is where I want to pivot as I maybe wrap up before we open for questions and turn to the panel. But I do think I'm a big supporter and a big champion of innovative thinking, of innovation overall. And as I would like to just sort of, suggest to you, I think there's a lot of discussion around the technological innovations, the blue sky changes that are coming in so many parts of food and agriculture, whether it's artificial intelligence, it's drone technologies. It may be lab-based, plant-based proteins. There's just an endless list of advancements that are coming on that technology front. But innovation is more than technology. Innovation is social innovation. It's financial innovation. It's policy and institutional innovation. It's also a way of thinking. And I think this is an area where we have tremendous potential in order to be able to use different types of innovative approaches to, I think, address some of these bigger challenges. But one of the areas that I do become quite concerned about, especially in my travels to some of these very difficult places in the world, we talk about a digital divide emerging around the world. I'm worried about an innovation divide as well. And you can see here, you know, something as simple as having a battery and a basic solar panel may seem to many as one of the most basic, simplistic forms of innovation. We don't talk very often about even the simple forms of needing electrification in many of the advanced agricultural economies of the world. Simple water pumps and water wells that are not running with any fancy algorithm supporting them or behind them. This is, again, incredibly basic and simple, but in a place like South Sudan, a place like Afghanistan, a place like Yemen, these are the types of innovations that can truly transform the lives of people who are there. But on the other end of that spectrum, if we think about the direction, the longer term direction of where agri-food technologies and innovations can go, it almost seems like the sky's the limit in some ways. I won't go into detail about each one of these different areas of emerging agri-food technologies, but I know that there at the university, you also are focused on a number of foresight approaches. And I think this is a really interesting output from our Office of Innovation, where over the last year, they've looked at about 170 different emerging, pre-emerging technologies and innovations. And out of those really sort of, you know, found about 8 different areas, 8 different clusters that really have the potential to be the most transformative. And ultimately, the main driver of why do we need the transformation is really climate change. And so whether it's biotechnology, whether it's in the renewable energy, digital technologies, geospatial, but you see here, financial innovations, policy innovations, this type of prioritization and this type of focus on really blending and advancing the innovation and technology that maybe is even coming in a sector outside of agriculture with what we do in food systems and food and agriculture is, I think, a really important way forward. And the last thing, my last slide that I'll end with here is I have been a part of a number of organizations prior to coming into FAO where we've really depended on the importance of building maybe non-traditional partnerships, putting people who don't always expect that they would be in a room with another group. We seem quite different. Maybe we don't come from the same sector. We don't come from the same space. I don't think we have the luxury any longer, given the state of what I've presented to you and for us in the UN, the difficulties we're going to have of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, to staying in our very siloed approach of who we work with and how we work with them. And so a very important area for us at FAO is to try to strengthen the kinds of alliances and partnerships that we have with the types of organizations that are here, to think differently, to think more creatively, to be more innovative, to put more unconventional ideas on the table, to stop focusing sort of on the complexity of the problem and get to the heart of the solution that's needed, the actions that can be taken. Some of these have been long-standing partners for FAO. A few are newly prioritized. We need better alliances with people who are our donors and our funders. The resources that are available to take on most of these challenges are getting stretched. They're thinner and thinner. And so we have to be more creative about how we resource and how we finance the work that needs to be done here. The private sector has sort of long been, I'll maybe say, please don't quote me on this, but I'll say it, has sort of been vilified in a way by, I would say, the UN system at large. Certainly civil society, private sector, competition, different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different priorities. But I don't think we have the luxury any longer of questioning the role of the private sector in bringing solutions, bringing data, bringing financing, bringing investment to the kinds of work that we do as well. So out of all of this, certainly universities and academic institutions are critical to the work that we do. So let me just close by once again thanking all of you for the opportunity to be here for this first session. Let me applaud you for the work that you're doing at the university around specifically food systems, strengthening them, trying to be creative and bold in how we develop a better, more effective, more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable set of food systems for the world. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and I look forward to hearing comments and questions and being a part of the panel discussion as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth, for that fantastic talk and the wide-ranging work of FAO that I wasn't aware of, and I've known about FAO all of my professional career. So absolutely insightful. Also coming from a farm background, I'm a strong believer that, farming has got to be part of the solution, and it does get a bad press often everywhere around the globe, but we have to move forward. We can't move backwards. So yes, very many things. I mean, you touched on so many topics that we could digest at length, I fear. I mean, some of the things that you mentioned, the fact that there's a climate disaster, one climate disaster per day. I mean, this is somewhat shocking in the sense of the statistics that the world is now living through. The number of countries that are affected that we need to try and help collectively as well. And the kinds of countries that are affected, particularly within the African continent, does strike me as certainly we need urgent action in different parts of the world. And I think we do need a multitude of solutions in the toolkit. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for each situation. I think we need to look beyond that. And, hopefully what you're doing with the FAO, what you're doing with your partners and what we're doing within the university and with our partners are all aligning to this. And there's certainly so much of what you talked about that for me really resonates with what we're trying to achieve as well. But I'm not going to steal the discussion panel. I'm going to bring in my colleagues initially to give their reflections. I'm going to turn to Zoe first to perhaps sort of touch on your thoughts around not just the talk, Zoe, but what role science might play within this and what we can offer from our academic expertise.
Thank you, Paul, and say thank you, Beth, for a really interesting and diverse talk. And I think, as Paul has said, you really highlighted the range of activities and the scope that FAO plays, and I hadn't really appreciated that. I think another thing that I found really interesting is the impact of crisis in various ways on the food system and poverty, nutrition, etc., and highlighting the impact of the sort of areas of war and devastation that is creating really significant problems going forward. I think from here we tend to focus on perhaps the impact of climate very much more because we see the extremes there, and a lot of the work that I think is coming out of Nottingham and has been sort of focused towards adaptations towards climate change. And one of the, I think, the big issues is the unpredictability of some of these things, and I think the same thing goes for for the war situations, is that one wasn't able to really expect some of those things to suddenly erupt in the way they did. In terms of environmental change and the impact, we're seeing lots of different challenges in often in the same parts of the world, but extremes in totally different directions, which I think makes a really major challenge for agriculture, because you may be able to adapt to drought and heat stress, but actually it may be that you've got flood stress the next instant, and where you have things like very major storms and the devastation that is created in the same way that you get from the conflict. So I think those are really interesting questions for the science, the policymakers, everybody to really be aware of. I think another reflection that I have is in terms of education, actually, and I think this is a really key driver going forward. And we've seen it a little bit in terms of agriculture over recent years, in my time of being associated with it, is that people now realize actually where the food they're eating comes from much more than they ever used to, and that understanding is really important. I mean, clearly, farmers and people at the really sharp end of some of these challenges understand, the brutality of that. But actually, most people don't. And things like COVID actually brought that very much more to the fore, that suddenly they weren't able to get the things that they were expecting. And that realization has been really important, because I think many of the things that we need to be doing, we need to think about with that lens, because with, as you pointed out, there are huge amounts of innovation that are possible and are being developed by the science communities, but actually whether they will be adopted and the challenges that they face are really difficult, and we need to have education to be able to break down some of those things. So clearly you've mentioned some of the opportunities from science, and I think the integration and the partnership of those is key going forward. So one of perhaps the most major things I think will be the gene editing, and the fact that will enable us to be much more agile in our ways of going forward, and that technology may well be quite acceptable going forward, whereas other things have been much more of a challenge. But I think the understanding that is needed by people, policymakers, and that real partnership also to make sure that actually food can get to the right places in the right time is going to be key. So I'm not sure how long you wanted me to talk from, Paul, but maybe is that sufficient, or
That's
would you
great.
like more?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I guess at this stage I'm just really interested in the panel sort of views and reflections, and I think I'll come back to some of those things that you've mentioned there, Zoe. Anne, perhaps I could turn to you to sort of think about the more social aspects of food. How does social inclusion work, and how can we help improve things, and how can we help connectivity? But also, you obviously your own thoughts on Beth's talk.
Thank you, Paul. I was trying to sort of summarize my own kind of reflections now. And thank you, Beth, as well, for a really thought-provoking presentation. I think something really stuck with me around, well, several things, but I'll just point out what you were talking about in terms of the better life, the good life. And for me, food is central to living a good life. And so I think that's part of as well the kind of reframing of the discourse and the narrative, and how we bring people together around what food futures might be. I think where I'd like to come in is perhaps because we're focused on futures, aren't we? And we're talking about solutions, interventions, and so on. I think I'd like to bring us also back to contextualizing and the importance of actually acknowledging where we've come from before we jump to where we're going. Because I think we run otherwise the risk of repeating some of the problematic practices that we see. And to me, there's a really important piece there, and specifically from the work that I do around kind of how do we actually drive more equitable food systems, who are, you know, the solutions and interventions serving, who's developing them, who's part of the conversation, who's excluded, who's included, and who actually needs to be there because they've been traditionally marginalized. And I think, you know, we can't ignore the fact that most of our extended global food supply chains are historically rooted in colonial legacies. And so, you know, what we're seeing in terms of how power dynamics are happening across food systems and food supply chains is deeply problematic. And I think I do see a role, obviously, in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, in terms of science, but I also, obviously, I'm very mindful of how we need to make sure that we don't disconnect those kind of innovations, these developments from the social, political, and cultural realities, because otherwise we are going to again marginalize the most marginalized, and then serve, you know, the interest of a few. So that's where I'm coming from, and I think, you know, your points on the need of a systems approach for me is very strong, and I would say actually that means also looking very much around joining up, you know, the voices, if possible, using perhaps well, you know, university spaces or the FAO to bring these different voices together, and particularly those who've been traditionally marginalized, to kind of really explore the kind of ripple effects and the multiple level of consequences of putting forward certain interventions. But also, yeah, trying to see where innovation might come from, perhaps not from the usual spaces. You know, a lot of the work that we do with the different teams I'm involved in is very engaged and based on principles of co-creation. So I think I've, you know, moving away from this idea that I've got it all figured out, because I don't. And the people who live the reality on the ground will have much better ideas than I do. And I, you know, so that's my reflection, Paul. I'm not sure I've answered your question directly, but that's where I'm coming from.
No, that's great. Thank you. I think you've highlighted some important points that I'm going to ask Beth to comment on shortly, I think. But Asghar, perhaps I can turn to you now. I mean, Zoe mentioned, for example, topics of gene editing and how science can be useful. And Anna's just talked about, you know, different innovations and where they may come from and avoiding our past failures. I don't know whether you'd like to sort of reflect on those or bring your own thoughts in, but, you know, how do we get things to change from a technological point of view? For example, you know, we can develop biotechnological innovations, but what is the role of getting those out there, do you think?
All right, thank you, Paul and Beth, for the nice presentation. My reflection is, before I give you the answer, one of my concern, and most of the people concerned, is the resilient food system in the conflict area. So when we talk about the food system in the conflict area, it's not only the food crisis, it's also of the agriculture knowledge and which we are lacking into that. And that is a major concern, you know, the lack of agricultural knowledge and prolonged displacement disrupt the transfer of farming skills and practices to the future generation, especially in the South Sudan and Gaza. You're talking about Ukraine and all those things. And these conflict regions often become reliance on the food imports, underlining the food sovereignty. So maybe what FOA can play a role in that. You have also mentioned, and Paul has also mentioned, the innovation in technology, which is a very good thing. A small innovation can change the life of the farmers and people in those areas, especially in the agri-food system. Being a post-harvest technologist, I feel that I always that just simply applying the low temperature technology in the South Africa and some of the Asian region can play a very significant role in achieving the food security. But the problem is there is no electricity. Someone you mentioned in your presentation, like solar panel, and this is playing a very important role in preserving the food or extending the shelf of the fruits and vegetables. Yes, of course, they can play a very important role, but how can we bring these feasible technologies, you know? It's not a problem of having the technology, but bring these technologies in the area where we need it the most. The most of the population are living in those areas where, in the South, in the Africa region, in the Asia region, where bringing this technology is a major problem there. You know, like, so for example, low temperature technology, edible coating, which can extend shelf life. You can't provide a modified atmosphere storage room in those areas, but at least some of the feasible technology you can provide. The major challenge is how can we bring these technologies. Somebody has mentioned about the education. Yes, education can play a role, but how the means the funding agencies, organizations like FAO playing a role in this particular area.
That's great. Thanks, Asghar. So, I mean, I'm going to try and summarize those for you then, Beth, perhaps for you to come back and give us your thoughts before I open it up to wider comments, I guess. So I think, as I say, there's a sort of an innovation there that science can play, and gene editing is certainly a key aspect of that. And I think that we need to be very open to that. And I'd like to get your views on that comment. Anne mentioned the points about not repeating our failures from the past. And, you know, there are lots of lessons, I think, to learn from history that we've done collectively badly. There are lots of things we've done collectively well as well. But also the comment about that Anne made around the power dynamics. And Beth, you mentioned around bringing in finance institutions, and we don't have the luxury of not bringing those in. But how will that play out with respect to, say, the power dynamics in those terms? And Asghar mentioned in particular sort of post-harvest technology and some of those almost basic technologies that if we can get implemented around the globe could actually reduce food waste significantly and help avoid many of these situations. So perhaps we can start with those few questions, Beth, and you can take them in any order that you'd like, and then I'll come to the questions that are on the chat.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. I was even, as the colleagues here were reflecting, I had a chance to look at some of the questions really well stated in the chat as well. So I'm looking forward to trying to respond to some of those. You know, on the question of gene editing, I will say this is, and I'm going to say this is Beth Bechdol's personal opinion, so I'm not speaking with an FAO quotation here, but I think the organization would likely agree. I agree, Zoe, that there's huge potential with gene editing, not just, as you said, from the power of the technology itself, but also I think the opportunity that we finally have at a policy level, a regulatory level, to move to the next iteration of a technology that is not gene engineering and modification, insertion of a gene from another, you know, species or another product, but really, I always view gene editing to me, and you're the scientist, I'm not, but for me, it's like a light with a dimmer switch. You know, that we're identifying, you know, traits within one particular crop, one particular species, and we're simply figuring out finally the tools that allow certain characteristics to kind of come on a little stronger, be a little brighter, be a little, you know, sort of, and to me, I'm very optimistic and hopeful that this will be the start of the generation of a set of techniques and tools that will move us beyond the, I think, controversy, whether it's consumers, whether it's, again, governments, policymakers, regulators around this. And you know, this is an opportunity where I would just like to say to this group, you know, I worked in the U.S. Department of Agriculture about 20 years ago, and actually was in the office of that department that oversaw the relationship with FAO. And okay, it's a government position, but the U.S. view at that time, this would have been in the mid 90s or late 90s, was that FAO was not serving its purpose to really sort of bring people together around the complexities of the issue of biotechnology and GMO as it was kind of emerging on the world stage. And I will tell you, at least when it comes to the US and maybe some other places, countries where these tools were really being advanced quite quickly, FAO lost a lot of credibility in the eyes of some of our members, not for taking a stand, not for taking a position, but for being, as I sort of said earlier, that neutral convener, that place where 195 members can come together and talk about advancements in science, talk about advancements in technology. They will always be difficult conversations with different positions, with different, directions that they can go. And so this is an area where I'm really pleased that our current Director General is a plant scientist. He's a plant breeder. And so he's brought that scientific way of thinking to the whole of the organization. And so this is an area where I think you're going to see a lot of exploration and a lot of collaboration from FAO with different groups and different stakeholders. On the social inclusion comments that Anne made, I couldn't agree more. And I agree that, we're in a space where I think there's a lot of attention to finding kind of new models of what food systems can be, should be, will be. And I mean, Paul, I think you said it, but there is not a one size fits all approach. And this is something that's coming from our side as a result of the Food Systems Summit that Secretary General Guterres organized a few years ago, and we keep revisiting the work of that summit to try to build national pathways for food systems transformation in individual countries with stakeholders of all kinds from those individual countries to really try to address much more localized, much more contextualized, and making sure that groups who have, as you said, Anne, been sort of left behind, and not just in recent years, have maybe been left behind for decades, are included in these discussions. One of the things that I think we're most proud of, and I will admit we probably still have more work to do as an organization, but is to really incorporate indigenous communities and indigenous peoples in the development of the work that we are doing, in the discussions that we are having, in the events that we are convening. I firmly believe that there is, in this space of next types of development of crop production practices, that the knowledge that comes from the history and the legacy of an indigenous population really should be kind of brought back to the fore and really thought about in terms of, its adaptability to environmental and climate issues, to its nutrition composition, to its cultural and its, social and traditional value of food for, connecting people to one another. And so it's just one aspect, but I think that's something that we are really trying to prioritize. And to Asghar's point, I couldn't agree more. I'm so happy you brought up the post-harvest comment. I think the current statistic is something like 33% of everything that is produced food-wise, agricultural-wise on this planet is lost or wasted. Obviously, two different components there, whether it's food loss or food waste, but those types of post-harvest storage, cold chain, all of those types of technologies, and as you said, also quite basic, quite simple in their form, and even oftentimes in their costs, are some of the most reasonable, smartest, I think, investments that we can make. FAO organizes an activity around the world called Farmer Field Schools. They started decades ago and were really focused around crop production, sustainable, conservation-minded production training practices for farmers. I've now gotten a chance to visit many of those in different countries, and I'm always so encouraged by the fact that we're now finding ways to incorporate training around post-harvest, around storage, around drying. And this is where we're finding private sector opportunities for providing the equipment, for subsidizing the equipment, for, some kind of cost sharing. And they are, as you said, some of the simplest of machines, whether it's a dryer or whether it's a, again, a particular, storage system, storage bag that's even provided. So I think this is another area where you've identified, we share that priority and focusing on that as well.
Right, thank you, Beth, for coming back on those points. I'm going to try and pick up on some of the comments in the chat now, and perhaps I can sort of just link to some of them. I'm not going to go in necessarily the order that they're put in the chat, but there's certainly a comment there from Emma that is around the view of the global north versus the global south, and how we don't end up, and using the word we again, but how we in the global north don't, try to go and tell people how to do things, when actually this is the completely wrong thing for everybody, and we need to help people develop their own solutions, perhaps.
I'm so glad the question got asked, especially given the comments that I shared with you at the beginning about our 195 members, because you can imagine, I mean, they come and sit in a room together. So in our building, we will have representatives from the global north, from the global south. We have the G77, we have the Africa group, we have the European group, we have the Asia group. And, I see, I think right now in this period as maybe it's a combination of things. I think with all of us coming out of the pandemic and the effect that had on, again, not necessarily leveling a playing field, but again, back to everyone was affected. That starts to change a mindset when everyone is affected. Now we've also seen the uptick of a number of very high profile conflicts, the war in Ukraine, and then the effect that had on African availability of commodities and food supply changed again a dynamic and a recognition of the dynamics between a north and a south, a west and a south. And now with the climate crisis as well being, sort of, again, impacting and affecting all, one of the things that it's not easy to get everyone to commit to, but one of the areas of how we try to bring investments and project work together in FAO is through this mechanism that we call South-South triangular cooperation. It used to be called South-South cooperation, which is interesting, meaning just across the South, Africa to Latin America, Africa to Asia. And we've really worked hard to advance that to be triangular, which means we're tying in the global north as well to a shared investment of some kind, a shared project, where maybe the project is in a country in Africa, but it's got support from European country. It's also got technical assistance that might be provided by a group of experts from China. It might become, we're trying to triangulate in a way to actually have everybody there on a single, sort of initiative working together. But some of this starts to, as you can imagine, sort of get into the geopolitics of the day, which are above my pay grade. And I have to sometimes realize that I can't control the dynamics of what's happening at a national government, administration to administration. But we are trying within our own organization to do everything we can to keep those divides from deepening or becoming, too embedded.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Thank you. And anything that certainly we can do as a university to play into that and help into that is really would be really good to be involved in. Just picking up on some of the other things in the chats. I mean, so there's a question about the sustainable development goals, and how important do you see these as things? I'm trying to find the right word, but as something that people can hold on to and work towards, or are they just a distraction?
I think they're super important. I don't think I could ever be quoted as saying they're a distraction. They're exactly what drives all of the work that we do. I think they are a critically important framework for how we as a united world take on more than even just the challenges that I touched on. You need a platform, you need a framework, you need a model of some kind. The problem we have is that we're not going to get there, and we're not really going to be close to getting there. And that's what's so discouraging about where we are in 2025 with only, less than 5 years. We say in FAO 4 harvests left to go before we get to 2030. The Secretary General of the UN has said, it's now about rescuing the SDGs. It's not about sort of how we get there, but how we rescue them. My personal sense would be that we probably in a couple of years will get to a place, there'll likely be a new Secretary General as the term of the current one expires. The whole system may keep the Sustainable Development Goals, but sort of kick the timeline down the road a little bit. And so I think for me, I kind of hope, given where we are in the UN system, we don't try to deconstruct them completely and start all over, renegotiating new ones. But I do think they have given, people something to think about in terms of advocacy and how do you promote and talk about these challenging issues within a context or within a framework of a solution-oriented, kind of action-oriented set of responses. And people find where they fit into the SDGs. And I think that too is right now an important part. But they will have to be reassessed, and we won't. I wish we would have more to celebrate in 2030 around this agenda than I expect we likely will.
Yeah. Unfortunately, progress often always seems to be slower than everyone wants.
Yeah.
I mean, just sort of extending that point about the SDGs, of course, because one of those is around, fairness of work as well as being healthy. And within agriculture around the world, we're finding that there are fewer and fewer people who actually want to be involved in the primary production of agricultural activities because it's hard work. It probably does have negative health impacts in certain contexts. So how do we square the circle of keeping people engaged in agriculture and primary food production to ensure that, we can all survive globally, but also ensuring people have healthy lives, and do healthcare organizations have an increasing role to play in that?
Absolutely. And I'm glad both of those topics got brought up. I think I even reflect on this in my own sort of past professional lives. It shows you the evolution of thinking around agriculture, at least in some countries. I remember when I was in the US in Washington and working on, again, admittedly, US agricultural policy issues. And at the time, the whole focus was on safe, abundant and affordable food systems. Probably wasn't even a system. It was, the agricultural sector. We didn't talk about healthy. We didn't talk about nutritious. We didn't talk about sustainable. This was 20 plus years ago. And so to hear, and see that there is now, I think, a collective global recognition that we have 3 billion people in the world who can't afford a healthy diet. In all of the places that I just talked about, where these challenging emergency responses are being managed, I saw a question in the chat about the difference between FAO and WFP as an example. Our colleagues at the World Food Program are there to deliver food assistance, immediate, right, off the backs of trucks, helicopters, planes, etc. But that food assistance is some of the most basic types of commodities. It's wheat flour, it's vegetable oil, it's staple crop, processed. It's not protein. It's not fruits and vegetables. It's not milk for children who are suffering. And this is something that I am increasingly personally more and more concerned about in making sure, which is why an agricultural assistance response in some of these emergency settings to ensure that food can be grown locally, animals can be kept in a healthy, it's not just because it's part of an income, it's because it's contributing to a healthy, diet for a child in Gaza, for a family in Ukraine, so this focus on health and nutrition is something that all of us, I think, need to elevate. And I love the point about connecting healthcare, medical, pharmaceutical, bioscience advancements with food and agriculture. Back again to my earlier comment about sort of the unexpected, non-traditional relationships. I mean, in some ways, these are sectors and spaces that 10, 20 years ago didn't really see that they had much in common. And this is the importance of this systems approach to agri-food directions. And on labor, let me just say very quickly there, I think we have got to focus on the next generation in a really urgent and critical way, to get them motivated and excited about opportunities in agriculture. And very sadly, it may not always be getting them excited about farming. We need to demonstrate that farming is not just dusty, dirty, laborious, make no money, not profitable. But I do think the emergence of digital, of technology, of data, of automation, these are hooks. I mean, a cell phone and an ability to build an app for a market exchange tool in Africa for a 19-year-old should be something in terms of supporting an entrepreneurial mindset. Go build something, go use this as a tool to be a part of the food and agricultural economy, and to make a life, and to do something exciting and do something that means a lot to the people who are in your community or in your country. So I don't know, we haven't taken this on as a sort of holistic kind of initiative yet, but my personal view is if we lose this opportunity now to capture the attention and the curiosity and the sort of entrepreneurial spirit of this next young generation, especially in Africa, we will have missed a huge opportunity, and I don't know that we'll get it back in a subsequent generation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Zoe, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think that, there are going to be huge opportunities going forward to really use the innovations and take agriculture to a very different place and level than it has been. I think it's perhaps also really important that the value of agricultural processes and food is front and center, because we tend to just think of it, well, at least in most places in the West, as very available. It's not, it doesn't really have very much value. It's an essential commodity that we expect, but we don't give it the value that perhaps we should do. And then that has knock-ons to the people that are producing it and the value and the livelihoods that it's created. Now, the other thing that I suppose I just wanted to mention, which I think is a bit of an elephant in the room as well, is overconsumption. And clearly the link between that and health, we've discussed it in relation to waste, but actually as part of that educational piece, the value of food, the value of health, there has to be sort of a baseline leveling there. And again, through the younger generation, I think hopefully the way forward will be to centre it on that.
And how do we get food manufacturers to limit the use of, certain ingredients, ultra high processed foods, better packaging that doesn't, sort of contribute to that behavioral response of how many of these cookies I'll do an entire tray because and those are things that could have big impacts on our health and nutrition metrics.
Anne, would you like to come back?
Yes, there are many thoughts in my mind again, and there are lots of questions in the Q&A, and I can't help myself. I've been posting comments, but I think in terms of yeah, there's a point around the value, and I couldn't agree more in terms of the importance of revaluing food more broadly. But I think that comes as a package in terms of revaluing beyond the kind of economic value. I think revaluing the labor that goes into producing our food. I think and I think we here, most of my work is within the UK. That's the context that I know. But I think there's an increasing, a disconnect between people and the provenance of their food. And I mean by food here, I mean the raw ingredients and agriculture. And I think, that disconnect is reinforced by, lots of public media narratives. Again, I go back to the power dynamics, but obviously the disconnect serves certain players in the supply chain, and maintaining that illusion that we can be cheap has detrimental consequences to not only the people in those chains, but also the environment that we kind of continue to exploit. So I think there's a big value piece to do there, and actually valuing work that goes into farming. And I think for me, I think in terms of moving towards the next, generation, I do a lot of work with community organizations and grassroots movement. And I see a lot of passion among a lot of young people around going back to the land, to working the land, and not necessarily because there's an appeal with technology. Actually, it's actually this recognition that we're intrinsically, part of nature. And it's fundamental. So I think, for me, there's a big kind of value piece there. There's and I think that will help if we're able to do that kind of transformation across the piece.
Great, thank you, Anne. I'm really conscious of time, and I got the 5-minute left in your meeting flag pop up in front of me. So I'll just I'll finish with a couple of points just before briefly handing to Pete to close off the meeting. I mean, I think the whole mobile phone technology, if we can get the solar panels to charge the batteries, to charge the phone, to provide the farmers with the weather forecasts, with the grain market information, with the where you can get this from, etc., could be transformational in many contexts. And certainly from my reading of the topic more broadly, I don't think we should underestimate the value of female education around the world in transforming absolutely everything, not just about food production, but about the whole economy. And I think that's a really important piece to just throw in the mix. I know we don't have time to debate it, but I think it's something that's really fundamental. Beth, from me, a huge thanks once again. Really insightful talk from my point of view, and I know the panel are all feeling the same way, and I hope the people on the call are. But I'm going to hand back to our director, Pete, to close.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And and I think I would just like to kind of restate those massive thanks. And I think, what we've heard today has been a really great introduction for this series. It's given a really big picture and helped contextualize all of our work and think about, well, how does that fit into that wider system and the challenges that the citizens across the world are facing in different contexts. And I think it is really important to zoom out of our everyday lives and think about what is that bigger picture and I guess also zoom out and think about those timescales. I think and it was really nice, Beth, that you started going back 80 years to when FAO was made, and I think in a way thinking about the future is we need to also zoom out and think, where will we be in 50 years, where we'll be in 100 years, and therefore what are the key topics that we need to be thinking about. And I think the discussion has been fantastic to sort of navigate that story throughout today. So I think thank you to all our panelists. Thank you particularly to Beth for the great talk to stimulate the conversation, and thank you everybody for joining today.